today I'm building a golf bag strap. I already got the strap pretty much done. It's pretty simple. It's a pretty big swivel style clasp back and front, and then bigger belt holes, about 5 and 1 inch increments. It kind of looks kind of like a weightlifting belt. I was originally going to use a little bit more curves in it, using a template kind of like this, but I decided not to, just go for more of an angular look, making it for an older style golf bag. So I decided on making it a little bit more rustic stylization. I used an edge groover on the edge and then widened it out with a teardrop stamp. Yeah, stamp kind of like that. More just teardrop. Also, I think it's also known as a dimpler stamp. My next process is going to put some decoration on there. So I'm just using the Cricut software. Let's change that. Gotta go for more of a graffiti look, because if you don't know, Pain 101 is one of Casey Jones' catchphrases. Casey Jones from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. The reason why I'm doing this is because I have an older golf bag, and Casey Jones carries an older golf bag in the movie. We'll get this talent out of here. So if that looks good, let's go for width. So width, that I'm going to go for is a little under what my edges are, so it's probably going to go with 1 inch and 3/4. Let's see, 5. And then, so the top, the bottom of the angles for the top of the strap is what I'm going for. So overall it's about 19 inches, which for the length of the strap, flat to flat. But overall length, I went for 37 for the strap length. But you also need to remember to cut out a little extra. So I cut out about 2 inches extra, and then I'm not sure if you can see it, probably can't, but I skived the edges and then glued it down and then stitched the top, that way it wouldn't come loose. But so I'm gonna go for maybe a little over 10 inches. Let's go for 11.5 for height. That's doesn't look too bad. So let me cut this out really quick. So golf strap. Save. Computer apply. So project is saved. So we gotta choose. There we go. That's good. Continue. And then just gotta wait for my machine to commit. It's gonna take a minute. So I'm just gonna choose one material actually on my machine, which is I'm just gonna use regular vinyl. And my material is already loaded. I'll just cut it out. So the reason why I'm using a Cricut machine is because I honestly can't drop. But another reason why is so I can just stick the material on and basically use it as a stencil for cutting it out. Sorry. Cutting it out with a swivel knife. And then I'm going to stamp it out with a pretty wide stippler, angled stippler. So now I just got to cut. So I'm just going to the edge. Probably can't see that, but I can. I'm going to cut for some reason. So that's what I'm doing. Let's cut this. So the material I'm using for the stencil is just regular removable vinyl. That way it doesn't stick super hard to the material. I just have to cut another stencil out because it came out a little too wide. There's go back. So it's right there. Oh, go here. Customize. So just put this. That's a little way off. So 1.75. That changes the height, so I don't know the height. Change that to 1.5. So now it looks pretty good. So just make. So, easy cut. Fine. So like that. 5. Good. 6. Okay, right. 7. Yes. Space cut. Space cut. Make it. 7 years. Okay. I'm on that. Okay, we're about to. Sorry. Just go to set that aside, but I do need this. It's just mindless transfer. That's all it is. I also need the cutter, which I did have. I can find it in tools. Probably here. Maybe not. I'll do is, this is still pretty good material. What I'll do is put this in the these. What I'm going to do is keep this. Just be careful with tearing the material. And put that. This is our section, so it's messy. Some different material, so we're coming with it. Lines. Part. More so to showing this because I lost the footage of cutting this first part, but that's okay. You kind of see what I'm going for though. I'll just move that out of the way. Basically, all you need to do though is weed it, use some transfer tape, make sure you get it lined up all nice how you want it, and then you can start cutting it. So I'll show you more so on this back half on how to. Again, not really how to, but show you a few tricks I learned because I'm still kind of new to using a swivel knife. The swivel knife can be a little tricky. You just want to make sure it's sharp. So just use a piece of scrap, leather with some good polishing compound on it. And when you're using a swivel knife, you just want to make sure that your leather is wet. You don't want it too wet, but you don't want it too dry either. So if you get it a little too wet, that's fine. Wet leather just makes it a little easier to cut. So before you start cutting designs out that you want to look nice, just practice with your swivel knife. Just make a few straight lines. Practice like getting the right pressures and stuff. Because if one thing you can have, you almost want less pressure than you think. Because if you do it too hard, like that's too hard. You'll get rippling in your leather, and it'll make it pucker all sorts of weird ways. Once you start punching, you can kind of see it. This is my strap. It's just a scrap piece of leather, so I'm fine doing this. But it'll actually show up a little better too on this leather compound. When I fold it, I can kind of show the effects of stamping it. See how it made that the compound come up when I folded it like that? It's a lot. You just lose a lot of your strength that way. And when you punch it, you can almost punch through your leather if you're not careful. So just want to be careful. Another thing you can practice, which I always recommend to practice, doing kind of S curves and try and do a full circle with both pushing and pulling. That's a pretty good circle, but you can tell when you're pushing it, you're putting a lot more force into it, so it can kind of make those edges pucker. So it's almost better to drag one half and then go onto the other side and drag the other half. You can see, I tried to show that earlier, but the phone died, so that's not ideal. But I'm gonna move on from that topic because it's pretty fresh in my mind, but still just a touch sore about it. That's okay. Don't get frustrated with yourself. Just be patient. I struggle with patience a lot. Both patience with projects and myself. If you get a little too much water in it though, it's okay. Just kind of brush it, smooth it. You just kind of want color change. You don't want it to soak though. If it gets soaked all the way through, it's okay, but you're a lot more likely to cut a little too far into your material. You don't want that. It's a lot easier, but this is pretty thick leather. It's a lot harder to cut through this thicker leather, especially with a swivel knife because it is such a wide blade closer to the back of it. But the thing with swivel knives, you just want to make sure you're comfortable with it. It's a lot different motion. This is more so for me and maybe some other people that are just getting into leather working, or maybe even people that have been doing it for a while but haven't really got into carving leather or anything like this. So I'm just gonna start doing it. So the reason why I'm using this Cricut machine and this vinyl is because it's raised just enough where this pick isn't super sharp, but it's raised just enough where I can feel the edge of it with both my nail and with this sharp swivel knife. The reason why I did that is so that I can use it as a reference edge. Just makes it a lot easier for me to do that. Because if I didn't have that, I wouldn't have. I don't think I would have the confidence to cut into this leather as much as if I do have it. Because I'm sure you already know this. Leather is expensive. If you're getting into this hobby, you might be like, oh wow, this stuff is expensive. And you're right. Because it takes people a lot of time to make the leather. And it takes a lot of effort. So it makes sense why it's expensive. But it can be an expensive hobby. Like any other hobby. Some hobbies are more expensive than others. Yeah. But all hobbies can be very expensive. It just depends on what you're comfortable with. And I'll actually show you a different technique, because swivel knives, they can be cheap and they can be pretty good. Honestly, this one came from a pretty cheap leather kit on Amazon. But I pulled a little scalpel blade. I just need a handle for it. I'll be able to cut fingers on tin leather. But not necessarily a scalpel blade. It's just a simple X-Acto blade. But if you want to get into this hobby and you already have an X-Acto blade, which you might have already because they can be useful for stuff like the Cricut. Let me get some of this material and stuff out of the way. That doesn't bother you, it doesn't bother me. Let me straighten this out just a touch. It's foam brushes. But you don't necessarily, if you just want to like practice and you don't have a swivel blade already, you can use an X-Acto blade. The only thing is, the swivel blade makes it easier because you can, the whole point of it is that it swivels. That's probably obvious to a lot of people. But when I first started using it, I was like, why is it called a swivel blade? Oh, it swivels. It makes it a lot easier to cut and do this. But if you don't have a swivel blade, and you just have a simple X-Acto, an X-Acto knife, or even a scalpel blade, you can do it like this. And sometimes I know some people that only use scalpel blades because they can be a little more versatile with just full stop cutting the leather, but you can do some other stuff with it, and it's probably harder for you to see. It's definitely harder for you to see. But once I split it open, you can get kind of the same effect. The only thing is, it's sharper. Well, it can be sharper, so it can be a little different. I'm not going to go full stop into this leather with this X-Acto blade because I'm more used to the swivel blade at this point, but you can get kind of the same effect by using the X-Acto blade. If you're more comfortable with the X-Acto blade, that's fine. It's great actually because it can be a little more versatile of a tool. The nice thing about X-Acto blade is that you can use stuff like this. You can get really tight into the corners, kind of stab it through into how much you want it, and then push with your other finger. It doesn't get you as, in my opinion at least, you know, some people just use the X-Acto blade all the time. I'm gonna put that word down. It doesn't get you as clean a cut as a swivel blade. So if you can get a swivel blade, it makes your life a lot easier. But that's just my opinion because since it does have that wider blade, you can see what you're doing a lot better. And you're less likely to cut all the way into the material. Because you can use the bevels of the swivel blade and actually peel this template off. That way I can see this last little bit. This last little bit of that corner. Not necessarily the corner, but I think you know what I mean. But you can use the bevels kind of as a template, especially if you're working on this thicker material. Because once you know your angle, so you mostly want it 90 degrees to the leather, but when you're dragging it, it's kind of hard to show. But when that's might be a little easier. When you're dragging it, you want it like kind of close to 30 when you're dragging it. So when you're doing thicker material, you can also do more angle on it to try and use the bevels more as a reference. But when you're dragging it, you can use the bevels a little bit better as a reference to how deep you're cutting. But leather is also, when you're working it, it's more so about feel, I found, than pure just looking at the material. It's also about the feel of it. Am I going a little too deep? If so, maybe I should let off pressure just a little bit. Am I not going deep enough? Then put a little more pressure in. It's just all about practice, all about patience. I know a lot of people are probably like me. They struggle with patience. So, but patience and practice go hand in hand. Should we know that? That sounds obvious. Also, this video is not necessarily for. I want to say this. It's not necessarily for beginners, but it's not necessarily a tutorial either. But it's for people who just want to learn this. If they're just doing this as a hobby, then great. If they want to learn new techniques, also great. Because I'm learning new techniques as I do this project. Like I'm sure people have already thought of using vinyl or any other type of masking tape to use as a template, but more so to draw on the material and not necessarily use it as a cutting template. Like this corner template, it can be used as a drawing template, but it can also be used as a cutting template. You just have to be careful because it is plastic. You don't want to be cutting into it, but it's kind of with all templates. You don't want to be cutting into the template because you can dull your tool, you can mess up the template. But with this vinyl, it's a lot more forgiving because if you do cut into it, it might bum you out a little bit. I know it'll bum me out because you're like, dang it, I know I could do a little better with it. I know I can be a little more patient with it, but if you cut into it, it's not necessarily the end of the world because you're not cutting into a piece of metal or plastic. You just can kind of mess up your design a little bit. But since this is based, it's supposed to be kind of based off of the character Casey Jones from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, so I kind of said in the beginning. So it's not like this design, I don't have to be super precise. That's also why I chose this graffiti style print. I don't have to be super precise about it. And some actual, like, professional or traditionally trained leather workers are gonna might get a little upset with me. Which I do like their opinions. I want to learn from them, but also I'm just trying to learn, trying to feel a little better, get a little better with this craft. But I also love leatherworking because it can be so forgiving. For the most part, people in this craft are also pretty forgiving. They will teach you. They don't try and gatekeep their secrets. They're like, yeah, you want to learn? Cool. Come over here. Let me help you. Or oh, you just need help with this one little thing. Let me teach you how to do that. How I learned how to do that, which I think is cool. Just peeling these off, that way I know I'm done with it. Get it out of the way. But, there's a point. I don't want to take this one. That's helpful. No. I don't want to get there's teachers and teachers, and you can have after school you're going to. You just, if you're like me, you're going to teachers, you probably feel like that's what teachers like, without we're entertaining or interested, or you think you're interested, well, white collar, right? All teachers are really different from I don't know. Some teachers are there, might be some are all 15, they cater there to teaching the student, everything takes a lot. Every night, teacher, they take an effort, everyone's doing something. Okay. You know what I'm saying? It's a little older, but I always like teachers that are a little more interesting, or you put one to another, other day, trying to talk to their students, what's going on. It's like, why not be this one thing out? Not like this one thing in the classroom. This little stuff. But I right? I will probably cut it off. Yeah. So this design is looking pretty good. I think, like I said, it's not perfect, but I think it's perfect for this particular project because it's kind of going for a little more grunge style. Just because it's for an older golf bag. It's supposed to look like it was owned by Casey Jones. This is for my own personal use, but it's like kind of a cosplay item, but also a functional item. So that's why I'm doing this project. I'm gonna get a little more water in the starter. Oh, I didn't know it. So, Alexa, what time is it? So, it's getting a little late, but I don't think I should be too loud in this next step. So, I'm just going to use, I have a little granite block for stamping. You don't necessarily need it. You can use, I mean, if you have granite countertops, I know that's not ideal either, but it's just a flat surface to touch on. You can do it on your table, or if you have, you can buy little blocks of marble or granite like this for pretty cheap from like counter stores and stuff. They sell little samples for pretty cheap. But you can do it on a wooden table, or if you have like a mallet handle, you can do it on that too. You also don't need a mallet like this necessarily, this small. I think it's nice because it gives me a little more control. But you can, I don't know if I have it over here anymore. Let me see. Home Depot and a lot of other places sell like flooring mallets or soft face mallets. You can use one of those. You can use a metal hammer. It's not ideal, but you can use it. Just get a lighter hammer. This is just like a regular 16-ounce framing hammer. You don't really want to use this just because it is so heavy. You're not going to have the same control as this little like 8-ounce maul. and also you're gonna mushroom the tips of your stamps out. But most hardware stores sell little flooring mallets or just soft face mallets for pretty cheap. You can get a little more expensive ones that are going to be higher quality and better in general, but you don't need something like that. If you're a woodworker and you have a wood mallet, you can use that too, but I don't know. I found the ball just gives me a little more control. So I'm lightly tapping this. You don't want to tap it too hard. You mostly just want to kind of lift it up and let gravity do the work. Because if you tap it too hard, I can show you that actually. I'll just use this. This one's pretty beat up anyway. But if you tap it too hard, you can either A, damage your stamp, or so I'm tapping pretty hard there. But especially if you cut a little too deep. If you cut a little too deep, it's not a huge deal, just use a little less pressure. But if you cut a little too deep and you stamp super hard, you're gonna get really ugly stamps and it's gonna tear. It's gonna tear the leather really bad. Which it's not like I'm working on another piece. I'll bring it out really quick. This one's kind of puckered, but this is the top of the D&D box I'm building. You can kind of see I tore the edge of this because I cut a little too deep. This leather is thinner, and I was stamping pretty hard on it. But since it's the top of the box and it's going to be pretty flat when I glue it down, I can kind of hide those crines by, mind you, these aren't literal crines that I'm hiding. These are just little mess ups that I did, either by stamping a little too hard or letting the leather dry out a little too much. That's kind of why this is curved so much, because I wetted the whole thing and then let it dry out a little too much before. But that wasn't the cause of cracking. The cause of cracking was me stamping it and it not being wet enough, and also me cutting a little too deep. But since it's going to lay flat and I'm going to antique this piece, it's not going to be too bad. So I think it's going to come out pretty good. I think this piece is going to come out pretty good too. Another thing you can do when you're stamping is you don't want to get too wet either. Same with cutting. But another thing you can do when stamping it is you can do what's called casing, which is basically let the pretty much all the water dry out. So this is all dry, so that's why it has the like natural leather color. But this is still wet. See how this is mostly dry? That's what's called casing. So I'm stamping a little when it's still a little moist. Like when you stamp it, you can feel the moisture come out just a touch. But you can also stamp it while it's still wet like this. It won't just be as defined, and you won't get this darkening that's happening right here. But that's just one thing. So, over the edge. You can also use these stamps to kind of highlight or make shadows and stuff. What I'm going to do is just stipple the whole image of the letters, and then I'm going to dye the letters a dark red. I'm actually going to add one more stamp out of here, which if I can find it. So I'm going to stamp the letters a dark red, kind of how that vinyl looked, and then I'm going to put some leather resist on there, on the letters, and I might dye the strap a dark brown, and then I'll probably not vintage it, but I'll probably antique it. That's the better word for it, I feel like. Antique the letters and these grooves, which basically means I'm going to rub this all over it, and then fluff most of this gel off. That way, it just makes it look a little older. That way it kind of matches the look of the bag. What I'm making this for. I'm just stamping around this corner. Like it's basically the same tool as this bigger one, but it's a little better for getting around tight corners. So I'm going to use it around the bottom of this key. It can be a little difficult just because you don't want to disrupt the edges. If you hit it a little harder, what can happen? Which I was going for the look of it on that other piece I showed you. I was going for the look of that more puckered edge. You can get that, I don't want to show you on this piece, but you can get the more puckered edge by basically leaning your tool back into the groove and then hitting it. Which, if you like that look, you can go for it. Just on this piece, I'm going for more 90 degrees, a little bit cleaner stamping on it. Just because I kind of want it to look, I want it to have dimension, but still look two-dimensional. I don't know if that makes any sense, but the reason why is because I want it to kind of look like it came straight from a comic book. Just the look I'm going for. Like kind of out of a comic book, but also from the original movies, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtle movies. You also want to be careful with these little bit wider stamps because they're the same dimension, but if you hit it a little too hard and you're not dead on, in these thinner parts of the stamp, or not the stamp, sorry, in the thinner parts of your design, you could accidentally overstamp, and you can add stippling to the edge of it, which it doesn't look terrible, but it just muddies it just a touch. So I don't want to use it just for a phrase, just a touch, but that's not what it is, that's all I touch, that's all I do. Then you probably can't see it, but I can see it just because naked human eye is a lot better about seeing smaller and closer detail. But in this bottom portion of the P, it's smooth on top. The only thing I'm debating about doing is either stamping it with this because I can get a little flatter and just adding a little more stippling to it, or I have another stippling. Yeah, I have another stippling stamp that's more of that teardrop shape. So it gives you a little bit more stippling. And another thing you can do with the stamps, if you just want to add light designs, get the leather a little wetter. Let it dry for just a second. But you can also just use the stamps by basically taking it in the same position as your swivel knife. Just index on the back of it, kind of grip like light pencil. You can do more pencil style, but this gives you a little more downward force. You can just kind of rock your stamp just a little bit, especially with these stipples, because you're not going to, if you want it a little more raised, but you still want the stippling, you don't necessarily want to stamp it like by hitting it. You just want to add a little bit more of that texture. So this can give you just a little more control than hitting it. But just going over this a little bit more. And I think after I show you this, is this going to get the point across? I'm going to fast forward for you guys. That way this video isn't a billion years long. So this really tight ones like this, really tricky. Because you're not careful, you can either A, overstamp, or B, because there's the hole. There's not like it's like it's around the base. What you're going to see, it's just touch points. That is actually just touch. I'm going to be a big shot somewhere. I don't know. I'm going to this is very close. I'll be trying to do that. That was my next thing. You just want to find your little groove. But also really cut that way you stay on these. So this is how much stamping I'm just going to use this. I'm actually going to it's super lightweight, only up an inch, maybe half inch up into the water. Mine really, or something like this one, or to just kind of stamp it. So to use them, once I'm finished, I think it's fine. That's okay. It's all for me. So I'm going to stop the time lapse for a little bit just to show you a little bit better on how to stamp this, get the right kind of angle on it. But around these curves, you also just want to pay attention. Around tighter curves, you want to use a smaller stamp. That way, it doesn't muddle your design. You can go over it a little more. You also want to pay attention to those ripples. So what I do, you can see that. I don't know if you can see that. Just getting right. This stamp is a little wider than my design in that corner. But just try and be consistent with your hammer blows. The nice thing, though, is you can also go back with, the stippling tool. You can kind of see it. Yeah. You can go back with that on these corners to try and get some of the rippling or that peeking out. And I'm just gonna flip my line around, get a little more water in there. But yeah, it's not. Might take you a little while to figure out the stamps, but I'm pretty much just lifting it up and letting it drop. That way it's a little more consistent. And it's kind of the same thing when you're cutting. When you're cutting it, you follow the left side, but when you're stamping it, it might be a little easier to see what you're doing if you're following on the right side of the material. It's also easier to see the lines if you're punching closer. If you're following the line closer to you, it can be a little easier to follow the lines. I've always gone a little bit better. Just play on your design. Doing returning just scraps a letter that you don't need. I would say practice stamping on that, but just try and practice what you need, and also practice how hard you're getting. Because that's the biggest thing. If you're like me, you start melting and start lettering. It can be a little difficult trying to have a soft touch. But also help sometimes. I don't know. Yeah, so that one looks pretty good. It looks pretty good. And I don't know if you can see that, but in that center, right there, that center, it doesn't have any of the stippling on there. So I'll just go back lightly with this little teardrop shape again and super lightly tap it. You can also, the cool thing about these stipplers is it can almost help you follow your lines a little bit better than just a flat, rather than just a flat tool like this. So this is basically the same tool as this, but it doesn't have the texture on there. And this can this can be a really cool tool. You can do a lot of cool things with it. But this tool, since it grabs the material, it can help you follow the lines a lot easier. And just gotta be careful also with, I almost stamped this wrong. I almost started stamping the inside of the empty space on this 0. You just have to be careful. So it could be helpful if you have a piece of tape or something to mark it off. That way you just remember to not stamp that, because you just have to pay attention though. That sounds super easy, but if you kind of get in the zone and you're not paying attention to little details like that, you can ruin your design, and it's not going to be happy days, because you can, leather is pretty forgiving, but it's a pretty forgiving material, but also you don't want to just, it's almost peace of mind if you do have like a little mark on there or something. You can use pencil, just super light pencil, but if you're not careful of that, you can mess up a pretty important part. You just have to pay attention to your tool. And yeah, but I'm gonna speed this up, that way you're not watching me for forever. So yeah. So now that I'm done stamping it, I'm gonna start dyeing it. I'm gonna dye the letters with this scarlet red, but I also mixed in a little bit of this coal black to make it a little more dark. You can kind of play around with your different mixtures, just to get the desired coloring and stuff. But this is just water-based dye. Well, it's, yeah. I have it just in this little dish, and just using kind of a fine paintbrush. You just want to get a little bit in there. That way you're not dripping it on your other pieces. Just try and stay in your border. It's kind of easier to do, since if you did stamp it, you can use the edge of your design, but just do a super light touch in order to not bleed it over onto your blank leather. I don't paint a lot, so I'm still getting kind of used to it. Just every once in a while, go back into your dye. Super light pressure. You can repaint it to get darker spots, but once it fully dries, it can lighten up just a little bit. And just kind of go slow with it. You don't want to overdo your dye. But once you get the desired look, it's a lot easier. And just kind of paint over it lightly. You almost want to use a finer tip than what this is, just that way you can get into the corners a little bit easier of it. But this is coming out pretty good. Just go slow. Now, you don't have to paint with your left hand. I'm not super ambidextrous, but when I weld, I do weld with both my hands, just that way I can get a little better look at what I'm doing, and that way I don't have to flip my material as much. With painting, it's a little easier, or dyeing rather, it's a little easier for me to do with both hands. When I'm cutting, I don't like to do it with both hands, just because I found that I don't have as much control necessarily, and you don't really want to load your brush. If you've ever painted models and have done like washes or distressing on stuff, you want to get about that same amount of paint in it. That way you don't, like, I kind of messed up just a little bit on this P. I don't know if you can see that, but there's that little bit darker blotch right there. That's where a lot of dye went. So just super light pressure. And you can go back over it if you don't get the color you want, but it's always better to go a little lighter for the first pass. And it's going to sound weird, but dyeing leather, if you've ever done watercolors, that's the best analog I can kind of give you, because it's kind of that thickness. If there's other paints, there's also these acrylic, these leather paints. They're kind of a flexible acrylic, and that's way thicker than these dyes. But you can do some cool things with that. With the paint, you can make some details pop. Like, I'll probably do that in the future. It's cool for D&D stuff, or if you're doing runes in leatherworking, because it can, especially if you do the stippling, it can almost look like a piece of metal, or especially with the stippling, because it can make it look like a crude piece of metal that somebody stamped out and applied to the leather. But there's so many different types of dyes and so many different colors. Just find the one you like. I really like that crimson red by itself, but you can add either that coal black or some different colors in it. Like if you add a green, it can brighten that up a little bit, or if you add blue, it can make it a cooler tone. Which, I kind of learned color stuff from art class, and that can help a little bit, but I learned about warmer and cooler tones in order to make something a little different looking. I'll probably go into time lapse in a second. You just want to find your groove with this stuff, because if you can definitely over dye if you're not careful. That's why you kind of want a little bit more pointed or detail brush, because since it's so long and it's a little less fine, it makes it a little easier to mess up. But I'm just going over in the corner first to give myself a little bit of a workout standoff, and I'm going back over to make it a little easier. Yeah, so I'm out of dye, go back to it, but you don't want to super saturate your brush, because then it's a lot easier to make it bleed onto the other side of it. And this is probably going to take the longest if you have super detail pieces and you want to do. This is kind of showing background work, but because what you can do with the dyes is you can do different colors in it. So I'm doing this red for this background, and then I'm going to go over the piece with this dark brown. I'm not going to go all over it, but I'm going to do the strap, that dark brown, and then I'm going to put some of this Pro Resist all over it and then antique it. But there's one more thing. Probably reiterating a lot of stuff during this video, but that's, again, more so for me to remember going over it again to get it a little darker. And another thing that you can do with these dyes to make your own colors and stuff, one thing that might be helpful to you is like a kitchen scale. And the reason for that is because you can kind of play around with the different saturation of the color. So this dye I'm using right now, it's 0.9 fluid ounces of the crimson red, or sorry, scarlet red rather, and then 0.1 ounces of this coal black, and I found that is got my desired color. Sorry if I'm being a little quiet. This stuff can be a little tedious, just a little stressful. I'm gonna go back over this little spot, get one more dye, pick up. You can probably see me, I'm rolling this when I'm picking up that dye. I don't know if it's a huge thing, but the reason why I'm kind of rolling it is more so for peace of mind, to me at least. But because my thought is, if you roll it, you're kind of making it like a honey dipper, and it's gonna just hold on to the dye a little bit more when you're transferring it. Probably doesn't really do anything. It's just for peace of mind on my part. Again, this isn't a how-to. It's just I'm still learning. So I'm almost done with the first part, and I think it's coming out pretty good. So, there's one little spot left. There we go. So, that's pretty good. And this nice little part. When you're mixing up the dye for different colors, I use one of these little squeeze bottles. That way it makes it a little easier to mix it up, but I transferred it in this little dish. That way it's just a little more accessible. I'm not trying to dip this brush in that long bottle and make it spill everywhere. It's the last thing you want, because if it spills everywhere, you might ruin your project, which I've done in the past. You know, it was a personal project, like for my own personal use, so it wasn't super devastating to me. But if you're like doing a commission piece or something, this is also for personal stuff, but like my own personal use. But if you are doing something for commission, or like you want to sell something, you just have to be a little more mindful, I think. And I think this is coming out pretty good. I might go back over with that stamp in a second, because I didn't see. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a little line that I missed There you go. So I'm actually, what I'm going to do, that way I don't forget, is I'm going to go back over it just lightly. Since this leather is fully dried, it's not going to stamp as nicely as the other parts, but it'll kind of, again, hide those crowns a little bit better. Get that, yeah. So there, now that I'm looking at it a little closer, I'm seeing some stuff that I missed, which, again, not a huge deal for this piece. Kind of want it to look a little crude, but I don't want it looking so crude that people will notice that. So I just went back over some little areas with that stamp. If your dies have a little more water content, and after you cut them, you can kind of use the dies to stamp it, and it might get it a little more defined. I don't know, I haven't really played around with that technique, but I've seen people do it in the past. Because if you're doing after this dries, I'm gonna put that resist just on these letters first. That way it's out of the way. I think that's what I'm gonna do, I'm not sure yet. I might just wait. But what can get you a little better, a little cleaner coverage sometimes is if you re-wet the leather, like re-wet the whole piece and then start dyeing. That can get you a little cleaner coverage sometimes. You can also, I'm choosing to use this black vintage this time, so I'm not going to do it like this, but what you can also do is put this Pro Resist over your design and then go over the whole piece with this vintage, and that'll give some color to the plain leather. If I were going to use, I have some other stuff. This stuff it doesn't work as good as this Vibings, but it works good enough for my general purposes. If I wanted the antiquing to be brown, I would definitely just use the Pro Resist over the letters, let it dry, and then do the antiquing over the whole piece, because it'll leave, I would probably do one coat of the antique, and then do another coat of the Pro Resist over the whole project, and then do another layer of that antiquing. But I want it to be a little darker in the design with the antiques. Just sorry, I haven't really told you the difference of it. Not quite sure the exact difference of it, honestly, but dyes they soak into leather a lot more than the vintage, unless you put the vintage on there and let it rest for like 15 minutes. Then it'll soak up a lot more of the dyes from the antiques. But the difference is the consistency, basically. So this isn't open yet, but and there's different ones that you can get. You can get the same thing basically in little jars, but that stuff has a little bit more thicker consistency than the stuff that comes out of this little squirt bottle. Gonna pick up a little more dye. So I actually need to go over this. Oh, just a little more. Get a little more pigment in there. So I'm actually gonna switch my hand over. Pick up a little more dye. Sorry if I'm bumping the camera a little bit. I'm just getting it right in that corner. So, super, super light pressure when I'm doing it on the edges. That way it doesn't try and... When I'm doing those edges, I'm tilting my paintbrush almost maybe like 20 degrees from 180. So from flat, I'm going about 20 degrees up. That way I'm using the tip of the brush, but I'm also using more of the brush closer to the inside. That way it gives me a little bit more of the border. Going over it, just I'm just picking up a little dye at the time. That way it doesn't get super saturated. So, there we go. If you pick up more dye at once, you don't have to go back as much, but you might not have the same depth control. What I mean by depth control is just depth of color, as if you pick up less. So, in my opinion, it's a little better to go with a little less dye. In some areas, I'm picking up more dye, but that's so I kind of get a little different coloration in different parts of valleys and peaks and stuff. If you hold your paintbrush in one spot a little longer, the leather will soak up a little more dye. So you just want to be careful with that too, because you can go over it again, but you almost want to start with you almost want to have a running start. So you want to start off of your leather and then kind of dip in and then keep going. That way it gives you a little more consistent color. You can, I don't know if you can see it for sure, but it's not show. It's a little easier to see off camera. The darker red on camera it almost has like a purplish color. If you've ever tried to write on, like if you've ever gotten bleach on your shoes and tried to color in with Sharpie, you know the Sharpie isn't black. It's more of a dark purple. But I'm just going over some areas a little bit more. If I'm seeing any bald spots on it, also known as holidays. Holidays are missing spots in your work, but you can go over it again. I'm going to let it dry for a little bit. After it's dried for a little bit longer, what I'm actually going to do right now is clean my paintbrush, and that way it's done. And I'm going to put this dye back into this container. That way I can reuse it, because I made quite a bit of it. And that was the reasons why I made so much, is so that I have it in the future for more projects. And also just so that it made it easier measurements for me. But yeah, I'm going to let this dry for a little bit. We'll see you in a few. So I've let the red dye dry for the most part. It's still a little wet, but not too bad. I'm going to go back with this finer brush first. I also have this bigger brush that I might go in with this brown dye. So I'm going to go around the letters first. Again, don't saturate your brush too much. I'm going to go around the letters first with this brown dye. And then I might use this bigger brush to get even more of a border around the letters. And then I'll go in with this dauber, which is basically just a cotton ball in this little metal pipe. It can help you move a lot of material around pretty quickly. So let's get started. Again, don't saturate your brush too much. But I'm going to start off a little high and then kind of work my way in. But I'm actually going to start on this edge that's a little closer to me. Just be careful with it, because you don't want to put any of this brown dye in your red. It's going to darken it up, which if you're going for that look, then you can. I'm not going to do it with this one, because I'm kind of going for that more handmade look, which, I mean, leatherworking for the most part, unless you buy it from the manufacturer, it's going to be mostly handmade. But for this, I'm kind of going for even more of a handmade look, because I'm trying to make it look like Casey Jones made it himself. Like he just wanted to, like his old strap broke or something, so he made a new one, but he wanted to make it his own. So I'm just going in. So I made that little border around it first. If you're good at painting, you can probably do this a lot quicker than I am and get a lot more even of a look. But I'm just slowly going over it, getting that border. I'm kind of doing a couple of passes. That way it does get a little bit of a darker look to it. I thought about adding some of that charcoal gray to this brown, but that charcoal gray is a different style of dye, so I don't know how it would react if I tried to mix it together. I don't know if it would create an exothermic reaction, heat up, and just boil the dye, or you just gotta be careful with that kind of stuff. If you're mixing dye colors, you might want to, if it's not made by the same people, you might want to just stay away from it that way. That way you don't risk it. But also, you just want well-ventilated area, especially when you're using this pro dye, because this stuff is more flammable and it has a little bit more of a fume in it. So just well-ventilated area. You probably want fan running too, to try and get some of the fumes out of your face. Or I might actually do it. It might muffle my voice a little bit, sorry. But you might also want to put a respirator on, or any style of mask. You can do like a simple bandana when you're doing it. I'm actually going to do that right now. That way I don't pass out on you guys. But yeah, let me do that right now real quick. But I'm just going around doing that border. I'm saturating this a little more though, just because it is a lighter color and I want it to be darker. So I'm just using a simple mask for this stuff. It was made for like dirt biking and stuff, but it has an air filter in it, so it works pretty good actually, and it's not too heavy on my face, which I like. I'm wearing gloves for this one, just because you can probably see that I accidentally spilled a little bit on my hand, and it dyed your hand. You just want to pay attention to that too, just be careful. When you're dyeing, you might want to wear gloves if you're comfortable and like aren't worried about it. You don't necessarily have to. I should have been wearing gloves for this stuff, but it'll be okay. So this thinner section right there, that's going to be a little difficult. So you just want to go super light on like thinner sections. That way you don't let it bleed in there. But I'm just going around. You kind of want to make a thicker border. That's why I might go back with that little bit of a bigger brush. But you can also kind of, if you hold your brush at a flatter angle, you can kind of get a little bit wider. But I'm just going to go in and paint it. This is a dark brown, but since this leather was hydrated and then got a little dehydrated, it might not come out the same as like if you do a test piece. So you just have to watch out for that. If you wet it again and you're using like a water-based dye, you might lift it up. And I was kind of scared of that, so I didn't re-wet this. But if you re-wet the leather, you can get a little bit more consistent look with it, and make it look a little a little neater. But I'm just going around, making sure I get enough where it soaks into the leather, but not too much where it will bleed. I'm probably reiterating a lot of this stuff, but just going over it a couple of different times, try and get it as dark as you want it. So I'm actually going to go back over to this end in order to try and get it a little closer to all the same color. But I'm going to go back to this over here, get a little more dye. Just don't let it sit, and don't let your brush sit in one spot for too long, because then it'll kind of lead to that darker spot on it, because you're just letting it the leather soak up more of the dye. So I'm just gonna go back and feather that in a little bit more. So once you get it around where you need it, you can either go back with more material to get it darker, or you can move on to a little bit of a bigger brush if you need to. Like if you feel more comfortable with adding a little bit more of a border, you might want to use a little bit of a bigger brush, or instead of a dauber, I don't have any of them, but instead of a dauber, you can use like one of those foam brushes, and it might give you a little more control because you have more of a defined edge on there. But when you're using one of those foam brushes and you load it up with material and you start painting, just try and not flip your brush over. I know it sounds weird. You're like, but I have more material on the other side of my brush. If you flip your paintbrush over, it might clog your brush, and so you just want to use the same side. If you need more material, just dip it, but try and use the same side of the brush. That way it doesn't clog it up when you're painting with the dye. With dye, it's not too bad, but you can clog that brush, clog one of the foam brushes with the dye. I'm just hitting the corners. So almost done with this border. And it's so same with when you're dyeing in your different stamps, like your different designs. It can be a little easier because it's actually embedded into the material, so you can use the edge of your design as a little bit of a barrier. If you go light enough, it can also help because you're not as close to your design. But if you go over the edge, you can get different colors that you're not desiring. So just going around a little bit more. So now that I have that done, I might go around a little bit more with that bigger brush. That way I can load up a little bit more pigment and start moving it. And I'm gonna clean this brush that way it doesn't get clogged and ruined. After you get done using the dye in your brush, you either want to clean it immediately with some water, or if you accidentally let it sit for a little too long, you can use acetone instead. Acetone is just a little more volatile, so it can mess with your brushes. And you can't really use you can, but it's really harsh on it. You can't really use the acetone on the foam brushes. So it might be better to buy the foam brushes in bulk. And you don't necessarily like paintbrushes. There's varying levels of paintbrushes. I've noticed that if you're actually painting, you want more expensive brushes. That way the hairs don't fall out and stuff. But with dyes, like these paintbrushes, they're pretty cheap. They're not the best quality, but they're good enough for this kind of stuff. But if you're actually like painting with these leather paints and you need some detail, you might want to buy some more expensive brushes. That way the hairs don't fall in and get caught in there. But I'm just going a little heavier around my design in order to get a little bit more of a border going. Trying to even out my design too. So I'm going over and I'm trying to feather in the design. So you might want to like go in one direction and then go back in another in order to get, because like I was saying earlier, leather has kind of a grain to it. So dyeing can be kind of similar to like sanding wood or metal. And the reason why I say that is because if you're sanding in one direction, you're going to get scratches in the material in that one direction. And then if you keep sanding in that one direction, you're not going to get all of your previous scratches out. That's just a little bit of a tangent, but I think it applies to this pretty well because you can kind of see the different coloration. Like I painted diagonally, so it has a little different look to it now. But if you go back and kind of feather it in and get a little more pigment, it can be a little difficult to try and figure that out. Like, where do I need a little bit more pigment? Where can I get a little bit of a cleaner look? If you also go around in circles, it can help with those strokes, your brush strokes. So if you get like one solid layer on there, but it looks a little strokey, like streaky, I mean, you can go back and kind of use the very tip and kind of go in circles to try and get it back to a little bit more level of a look. And I'm just gonna go in, since so I edge cut, I used a stitching group around the edge. It's gonna naturally pick up a little more dye because the flesh side. So I can kind of show you because I'm gonna dye the back of it too. On the flesh side, so the flesh side is more of like a fuzzy side. It's gonna pick up a lot more dye. And you can kind of see that it started off really dark and then it's soaked in quite a bit. So you can, I'll use a dauber on the back, that way I can lay a little bit more pigment on there. But you also want to be careful with that, because if you put too much pigment, it can soak through the leather, and it can ruin your different colors in your design. I'm gonna pause right here. Sorry, I have to take a quick phone call, but probably gonna speed this up in a second, just that way you don't see me die for a long time, because YouTube doesn't necessarily like that. But yeah, just going over, kind of filling back. So I'm gonna make a little bit more of a border around these letters. That way, when I move on to the dauber, it doesn't bleed into that red. Filling in between the letters too. Kind of doing some cross hatching, trying to just blend those colors in a little bit more. Alexa, play music. What's up? When you're using your dauber, you also don't want to load it up super. Rather, you don't want to load it up a lot, because I'll do it on the back side, that way it doesn't ruin this. I also haven't done it in a while, so just practice. Just do super light pressure when you're doing it, and you can do some swirls, and that'll help blend it in. But that's probably around what you want to do. So just going in, moving a lot of material. I'm trying to trap a little bit more dye into the edges. That way it doesn't come off as unfinished. Just going in circles. Since the dauber can pick up a lot more dye, it can come out a lot darker. So you might just want to play around with that too. Just around with less dye. Just trying to feather it in a little bit, get a little more dye. Just get it into the corners and feather it in. Super light pressure, and you can kind of use, since it's a ball, but once you put dye and you apply pressure, it can form some corners on there. You can kind of use that to define an edge and come in a little closer. You just want to be careful with it though. I'm just kind of blocking out my letters, and then I'll come in with that brush again to get it a little more defined. But this top part might be a little bit of an issue because it has that buckle, but you just want to kind of punch in a lot of dye just to get your stitches, your stitch holes saturated. But you can also see, so I'm pulling the buckle out of the way, and then I'm going to brush the top of it, kind of a lot of dye, get around that edge. It's not going to dye your buckle, but you don't want to get a lot on there because it can kind of make it a little sticky around your latches and stuff like that. So I'm just kind of coming around, flipping it over, getting a lot of dye in there. Just brush around, and then make sure you get all the edges, that way it doesn't look, like I said, unfinished. Just doing another pass. And you can use the undyed part to kind of lift some of your dye if you want. But just kind of, I'm pushing it in to my leather to try and saturate the edge. But yeah, I'm gonna put some music back on and probably fast forward it again. But on the back, you can kind of see you can get a lot more dye in it. And so after I'm done dyeing the back of it, that way it doesn't lift up and get on my clothes, I'm gonna use this Tokenol. It's burnishing gum, and then I'm also gonna use, you might be able to see it, I'm gonna use this burnishing glass. You don't have to use this if you have like a glass Tupperware container with rounded edges. That can work. I saw that on Skilltree, and I've tried it before, and it works pretty good actually. But you don't need this. If you have little pieces of glass that are rounded on the corner, then that can work too. But or you can use one of these on the back of it. It's not gonna be the same look, and this is gonna get you a little bit of a smoother edge. But this is just a burnishing stick. I'll probably go around the edges and burnish the edges too after I'm done with this. But yeah, Alexa, play music.
Sure, here's a lot of fun.
back leather is soaking up a lot more dye. You can probably see that. I just did this super, move that, oh, you can see a little bit. I just did this super dark. It's soaking up a lot of the dye. I'm trying to get it as perfect as I can, but I'm also running out of dye. So I probably won't get perfect coverage on this back, but it doesn't necessarily need to be perfect on the back part. You just want to make sure you get those edges pretty uniform. So see how this section is a little light. I'm just going back over it. Oops, sorry, didn't mean to poke you guys. But I think this is pretty good. I'm gonna let the dye dry, close this up, and then I will be back in a little bit. And you don't really want to keep these guys. I mean, you can, but once the dye dries out, it's not usable. So just buy them in bulk. It's gonna be a lot cheaper than buying those foam brushes. Like I bought 100 of those things for like $10, I think. That's not too bad. But yeah, I think this looks pretty good. I'm gonna let it dry, like I said, and then I'll probably go into burnishing it. After I burnish it, I'll put this Pro Resist all over it, and then I will use this black antiquing. And I think that'll be pretty good. And after I do that antiquing, I'll probably use the Pro Resist again, or I might do a leather wax as my top coat, but I'll probably just use this Pro Resist because it on the bottle it says once it's dry, it resists moisture, sun, and dirt. So I think that'll be a good application for it since it is a golf bag. Cool. See you in a little bit. So I let my dye dry for a little bit. It's not wet anymore, but you can see on the back it's definitely darker than the original leather, but it's not as dark as the front side. I mostly just dyed the back and the edge. That way, when it was flat up against something, you wouldn't really see the wraparound, like the wraparound in a different color. But what I'm gonna do now is use this tokenol to burnish it. We're gonna go with the edge first, and this might be a little difficult for me to do with the camera, but no, it should be fine actually. And I'm just gonna do it in sections actually, probably about 6-inch sections, maybe a little longer than that. Not quite sure, but if you try and do it all at once, what might happen is you might get dry sections in it and it won't burnish it right. So I'm just gonna grab a little bit on my finger. It's kind of the consistency of Elmer's glue, but I'm just gonna, or like a PLA glue. It's probably the closest consistency, but I'm just rubbing it on. I'm gonna let it dry for a second because on this bottle it says let it half dry. I'm actually gonna take this glove, that way I'm not rubbing the piece on. But instead of on your finger, you can also use a dauber or a little piece of plastic. But I'm gonna feel it. Yeah, it's still a little tacky, but I'm just gonna rub it down now. And when you're burnishing it, just find the right size. I can show you that too. Because my original idea for the golf strap was basically make a 1.5 inch wide leather strap and make a shoulder pad, but the shoulder pad was a little too wide and it wasn't gonna look exactly right. But if I use this thick of leather, because it's the same thickness as this stuff, or even a little thicker, but it's three layers thick. So in order to do that, I would have to use this big groove in the slicker. What you might want to do in order to get more of a rounded look instead of sharp corners like that, it rounded it off a little bit, but if you don't want those sharp corners, you might want to go around with a piece of sandpaper, or you can use like wood files and planers in order to get more of a chamfer and then go around slicking it. But since this stuff is a lot thinner than that, I'm just gonna feel it. I'm gonna go with this bottom groove and you want to apply not a lot of pressure because you might buckle the leather, but you want to just apply medium pressure and just go over it for a little bit. You can kind of see it, but if you're not getting your desired look, you can do multiple passes, or you can do more pressure. But it's a lot of, when you're burnishing it, you're just using either this burnishing gum, which can work really well, or you can even do it with this Pro Resist, but the Pro Resist is going to give you a little bit of a different consistency on it, or you can do it with water, but the water will give you more of a matte look to it, but it's just a lot. It might not work as well for you if you're doing some different types of leather, because this is just regular veg tan, that's why I could stamp it, but I don't know if I have any of that stuff here right now. Actually, I do. But this is more of a chrome tan, so it's a lot more flexible, and it's already finished, but you can't stamp it, because it's such a supple leather. This stuff is more for like handbags and stuff, but so I'm just going over it. You can't really do water with that stuff, it just doesn't mix well, because it's a different tanning process. Same with oil tanned leathers, you can't really do it with water, just because it won't penetrate and it won't saturate the leather enough in order to get the burnished look. But I'm probably gonna speed this up, that way you're not seeing me just rub this for a long time. But if it's a little more wet, you can see it creates a better look. So I might go over my previous spots. I'm actually gonna do that right now, that way I don't forget. But so I'm just gonna add a little more. You don't want to put a lot on there. You want to do your best to not let it bleed over the edges, but if it gets on the edges, it's not too big of a deal. But so it's still tacky. When your leather is still a little wet or tacky with that tokenol, or you can use gum trinket I can't pronounce the full word, but the shorthand for it is gum crag. You want it a little more wet and supple. If you have shallow edges, or shallow angles rather, you can kind of round them over. It's not too big of a deal, but if you have sharp corners and you don't want that, what you might want to use instead is one of these glass slickers and just hold it flat against your material and kind of round it over. You kind of do the same motion as if you're sanding, but you might also want to round your edges more. So what you'll start off with is one of these edger tools. It's kind of hard to see it, but it's basically a sharpened blade with a little groove in the edge. Then you'll go around the edges with it to chamfer the edges, and then you might want to go around with a piece of sandpaper in order to round the edge a little more. But this is coming out pretty good. You can also use the tapered edge to kind of round a little wider taper spot in your material. But I'm just going to speed this up. Alexa, play music. So when you're doing tails of belts, you don't necessarily want to go back and forth because you can roll the very tip of it. So what we're gonna do is get some more of this token. Sorry for that sigh. I'm tired. So I'm just kind of brushing it in one direction in order to not roll that corner. I'm just pushing it. You mostly want on the end of it. You mostly want to push away from the tip of it. You don't want to drag it because you might curl or push the tail in one direction. It's hard to see because of the grooves, but what I'm basically doing, I can get up to a certain point and brush back and forth to get a little quicker, but I'm getting up to a certain point, maybe, it's hard to show, but maybe you can see, I'm getting about like maybe a centimeter from the tip, about half an inch, and then I'm just going back to brushing and slicking forward. You can also use the dye as your like slicking ointment, but you just have to be careful rather, because these aren't really dye marks, they're from just the friction basically burning the wood. Not really burning it, but yeah, that's why there's dark marks. But you just want to be careful because I can show you on my other slicker. I was doing a project with that crimson red and I was using the tail to burnish the edge because it had a hole in it that I needed to burnish. You just want to be careful with that. You can like sand these down because they're just wood. But there's more expensive versions of these things too that are like made out of a dense plastic or a denser wood. They also make machines that make the process go a lot quicker, where you basically just brush whatever edge coat on. Shouldn't really say edge coat because there's a difference between the burnishing gums and an actual edge finishing paint or like edge coat. It's an actual paint they paint on and it covers the edge, which I mean, duh, right? But it's basically on high-end purses and stuff. They mostly use that edge coat because it's a lot quicker and it can last pretty long. But it doesn't necessarily last as long as actually burnishing it. It's just a lot cheaper and it's a lot quicker. But and you should probably wear gloves while doing this. I'm not super worried because, like I said, this stuff is it's not basically, but it's the same consistency and it's non-toxic. At least to my knowledge, it's non-toxic. Who knows? But to my knowledge, it's pretty much like PVA glue, like the toxicity level, and that's just Elmer's glue. PVA glue is just Elmer's glue. But so I'm just going back and probably fast forward. But just trying to keep this stuff off of my actual face leather in order to not stain it, but that can be difficult. You might want to like put tape over the face of it if you're like really worried about it. But like I said, I'm not trying to be super precious about this, but I'm still trying to make it look pretty good. So yeah, I'm just using the tail of it without the grooves in order to get tighter up against the clasp. But so that's coming out pretty good. You can kind of see it more on the backside. But when you do that burnishing gum and once you actually slick it, it's gonna make the leather look a lot darker because it's basically compressing the fibers of the leather. But I'm probably gonna speed this back up. Alexa, play music. Let's go. One more thing that I should have explained. You just want to keep, sorry, you just want to keep your groove pretty perpendicular. You don't want to try and, you just want to keep it pretty flat. That's why I'm kind of holding it in this, with my pinky and ring finger around the tip, and then kind of just cradling it like this. It's kind of a similar hold that you want to use with your mallet. But Alexa, play music. Alexa, change music to Garfunkel notes. Let's go. So now I'm going to burnish the back side, the flesh side. You can do it a couple different ways. This is just a rag made out of an old t-shirt. What you can do is pick up the tokenol, rub it over it, and then use another piece to brush it in. What I'm going to try and do is, with this glass, I'm going to try and, so I'm going to use this dauber first, brush that tokenol maybe a third of the way of the whole belt, and then burnish it. And just around around this folded over side, I might come in with this and brush around it to try and burnish that all the way. But I'm just debating about it because I can probably get away with using this glass too. But I'm just gonna use this dauber, pick up a little bit. That's quite a bit, so I'm gonna brush a little bit of it off. But so I'm just gonna brush it over, get the flesh. And they make this stuff in different colors too. I'm using the clear right now, but they make it in black and they make it in brown too. You can kind of see it's lifting a little bit of that color, but it's ultimately making this a lot darker. So that's actually gonna work out in my favor, I think. But just brush it about halfway through, and I'm gonna brush it down just to get some of the residual moisture off, and then burnish it with this piece of glass. You can kind of see it's, I'll show you a little bit closer too. I just want to do this before it dries out too much. Get a little more of this right around this edge. But I'm just gonna wipe the excess off. So I'll show you in a second. With this glass, you kind of want to use a lot of pressure to try it, just because you're also doing a bigger surface area. With the smaller surface with this, you don't necessarily have to push as hard. I'm also learning this. I'm not used to using this glass yet. But I mean, another reason why I'm using this old t-shirt is because it's a lint-free cloth. You can also use like those blue shop towels. You just don't want to use like a terry cloth or something with big fibers. But you can kind of see with the reflection, this is still the flesh side. This is the burnish side. You can kind of see it with the reflection. And you can also see those. That's why I was kind of worried. If you dye too much on the back, it can peek through. And you can kind of see that with the reflection. There we go. I kind of picked it up. You can kind of see the leathers coming through the backside when I'm burnishing this. But so I'm just applying a lot of pressure. Just trying to get this to get, there we go. Get this. I'm going to use this little knife to try and lift this little piece up. There we go. But I can kind of show you with this too. I might not use that, but what I'll show you is the other technique that you can do with just a rag. It's not going to work as well, but it'll work good enough for if you don't have any of that rounded glass. But so I'll kind of show you a little bit on this. If you have just a rag, I'm actually going to get to a little bit of the cleaner side. Can you just brush it really hard? It can kind of do the same thing, but it's not going to get you exactly what you're wanting necessarily. You might not be able to hear it, but that's pretty smooth. That's a little more scratchy, and then unfinished, really scratchy. So that was just to show you one technique. I'm gonna go back with glass because I'm trying to get this as smooth as possible. That way it doesn't wear and get any dye on my clothing. Just burnishing it can be one step to help you with it from lifting the dye, because you're just compressing those fibers over the dye. It almost acts kind of like Velcro in a way. I found just the best analogy I can give you for it. But just going over it. I'll do the small section with this burnishing stick just to show you. And so it's, I don't know if you can see it, it's a little hard, but it gives you a lot more streaks in the material because you're having to kind of roll it just to get the right level of pressure. And also if you're doing it like this, it works, but it's just a little harder than using this piece of glass because it gives you a little more leverage. But so I'm just going over it nice and smooth. But I'm gonna speed up again. Alexa, play music.
Sure, here's my phone.
You also want to be careful. So I'm done burnishing it, but you just want to be careful when you're around these edges. You might lift it up. So I'm just gonna go in with some of this leather cement, and so I'm just going in with it, and I'm just gonna use the back side of this dauber to try and paint both sides of it. You just want, when you're using leather cement or any type of contact cement, you just want to try and get as good of coverage as you can. So I'm gonna let that tack up just a minute. I'm just feeling around these edges, but I'm just gonna let that tack up for a minute. I'm going with my finger also to try and pick it. But cool. So now what I'm doing is just I'm pressing it down and wiping the excess. Not exactly what you're supposed to do. You should leave it to tack up just in a bit of a rush. So I'm just pushing it down. You can kind of use this to, so let me get this stuff out of the way. You can kind of use the head of your burnisher to, because I skived it, now I skived it. I'm just going around the edge, just going, wipe off the excess. And before I do anything else, I'm gonna let that finish drying. But if you're also worried about that, let me just close this up, that way it stops off gassing. If you're also worried about that though, what you can do is either put a rivet in the very tip of that way it doesn't peel up all the way, but that gives it a little more strength. Or you can go around before you skive it, edge groove it, punch it, skive it, then glue, then sew the edge. I just didn't, if I had a little more space widthwise, I was thinking about stitching kind of like a smiley face in the top to both add strength but just as kind of a funny look to it. But yeah, I'm gonna let, it's still a little rough near the tail. I'm not so worried about that, but I am going to burnish it a little more. That way, just more so for my safety. Oh, careful, don't break your fingers or toes. Toes are not fun because they can at least give you a splint for your finger, but not for your toes. You'd think they could, but they can't. They're just like, have a nice day, your toe is broken. Go home. Don't walk on it for a few hours. Just going to end with this rag again. I think this rag is actually going to give me a little bit of a better control because I can lift it up and put a little more pressure. When I was doing it earlier with this, it worked good, but for this tail, since it's not as wide as that other part, it doesn't have as much material, so you don't not twist on itself. So it was kind of twisting while I was doing this. You also want to be careful. So this is the back side, and I'm not super worried about it, but you can see it on this tail right there and there. There were stickers. There were price stickers on there. So when you do it, what you might want to do is lift those stickers right when you get home, and then get a rag with some acid. I would use acetone because it dries out and it doesn't leave as much of a residue. You can use this stuff, but this stuff leaves a residue, so you have to wipe it off with soap and water anyway, or go in with acetone to clean it. You might be able to use a degreaser, like a regular degreaser, like Simple Green or something, but I'm not sure how well that would do to get that sticker residue out. But if you do use that acetone, get some oil or run it under water really quick to try and evaporate that acetone off. But that's looking pretty good. Edges are pretty good. They're not perfect, but I think I feel a little bit of fuzziness, but it's not too bad. And you can go back with this. But that machine, I've never used that machine, but they also sell wheels for drills and stuff that basically do the same thing. But it's just a wheel with one groove in it usually, so you're kind of confined to one size. But those machines, they have the same amount of grooves on this. But yeah, so I'm gonna let that toenail dry and that glue dry for now, and then I'll be back and use this Pro Resist, brush it all over. And when you're using this Pro Resist on the bottle, at least, and well, I've done in the past because the bottle says it, I've used a sponge like this. This is like a makeup sponge, but I bought it. They sell them at the leather craft store, and you can cut these up if you need to, or you can use a rag like this and just get slightly wet, and then slightly wet, not damp, just slightly wet, and put this stuff on your rag or your sponge and wipe it all over it. And then you'll go in with this. After you're done with this, let this dry, but buff it after, and then put another coat of this, or you can use a different top coat on it. This is just what I have, and this works pretty well. So yeah. Now that burnishing gum is all dry, it's looking pretty good. Now I'm gonna cut this sponge up really quick. That way I have more pieces. Put that in my little cabinet. Soak up a lot of water into it. Just get most of it out. Let's see if I can show this. Not really. Picking up, squeezing out most of the water. I'm just double checking it's still good. Gonna use this Pro Resist. Get that water up real quick. Just use this Pro Resist. Get a good amount on there. And just start brushing it on. Just start at the front. Brush. Oh, let's see. You just want to kind of brush it on first, and then you can do swirls to get some of the streaks out and stuff. You can probably see it. It's picking up a little bit of that dye, but it's not too bad. Just, you're done brushing it on. Make sure you get this clasp. That way it's all covered. Waterproof, good. You can do multiple coats of this stuff too. I might do like 2 or 3 to start off with, and then start antiquing my letters and stuff. Just brushing it on. You want to be pretty liberal with it. That way it soaks into the leather good. Just doing swirls to try and get the streaks out of it, and then going back over. A pretty simple brushing matter. It's picking up a little more dye than I would personally like, but it's still not too bad. Just make sure you get your whole piece. Brush your edges. You can use this Pro Resistance as your burnishing material too, but I prefer not to, just because it doesn't have as much of a dry time as, or it has more of a dry time rather than some of the other different mediums that you can use. I'm actually pretty happy with this. It's kind of picking up some of this dye. It's kind of uniforming the color of it. It's looking pretty good. I'm just gonna do, it's a little tacky, but it's not too bad. Just going back over it, getting another coat on there. Making sure it's all saturated. That's looking pretty good. Cool. Do one more coat on the edge. Pick some of this up. Do it on the edge. Get it again on the front. If you're getting a little more streaks than you would like, you can also add a little more water to your sponge and then go back over it with the Pro Resist again. But I think that's pretty good. Just hitting around the clasp again. Just trying to get the best coverage I can. That way, that antiquing doesn't soak into leather. But that's pretty good. I'm gonna wash this sponge out, and I can reuse it too. I think that's pretty good. Just gonna wipe my hands down. I'm just gonna let that dry for a little bit, and then I'll go back over it. You also just want to make sure you get into the letters really good with that Pro Resist. Sorry, I'm running out of adjectives, but just clean up my workstation a little bit too. It's looking pretty good. But this stuff is still pretty tacky. You just want to wait until it's completely dry, and then go over it with this antiquing. But after this fully dries and I do that antiquing, one thing I'm actually going to do is add some eyelets. These are just 1/4 inch eyelets. They fit pretty well around this buckle. It's mostly just so that it doesn't wallow out that hole. It kind of adds a little more finished look. But you just want to make sure you also get long enough ones. It's kind of hard to see. These barely just poke out of the leather, but they're kind of, yeah. You might be able to see it a little better if I do it like, no, casting a little too much shadow. But they're just little 1/4 inch eyelets. They're also called grommets, but that's pretty much it. I will be back after this is dried. Now that Pro Resist is dry, I'm just going to squirt a little bit of this on there, right over the letters. Then I'll put a little bit at the tail and the nose of it, and just start swirling it around, getting it in the letters, getting it in these grooves. I'll show you the tail too, that way. I'm not trying to cover the whole piece, I'm just trying to get the grooves really good. And get it pushed into the letters. Then on this tail, I'm just trying to get it in the grooves. I'm not trying to get it in the holes, because I don't want it to get pushed in the holes and get trapped when I put those eyelets in. If you are keeping the holes without the eyelets, what you can do is use a Q-tip and pick some of the gel and put it in the holes, or you can put some of the dye in there. I'm actually gonna go over the whole piece and let it sit for a second. That way, I'm just gonna toss that. I'm gonna let this sit just for a second. That way, it soaks in a little bit. Then I'm gonna go over it just with a rag, brush. Try and lift up as much as as you can. Should let that resist dry a little longer. It'll be fine. There's her. Running hard. Hitting the letters. That way it picks most of this up. Just kind of leaves it in the crevices. Picking this up pretty good. You can also go in with the rag with the slicker. Just going in, trying to pick up as much as I can. Darken these letters up quite a lot, but it should be fine. Try and pick up as much as I can. I'm just gonna go. Just trying to see it a little more with the light. It's coming out pretty good. So yeah, you can kind of see it. Should a little more light on there. Kind of see the red peeking through. Just going in. What you can also do, instead of dumping this stuff on your material, you can put it on a rag first, and then do it really quick, and then brush it off basically immediately. But I think this is coming out pretty good. And while this stuff is drying, I'm gonna punch in these eyelets really quick. Keep those. I'm gonna punch those eyelets in really quick though. Basically, what you do is you have a little anvil, you have a stamp. I'm just gonna do this on my table. It's a little easier for me to see. But I'm actually gonna put these eyelets in first. That way I don't have to deal with them later. You want a pretty snug fit on the hole size when you're putting these in. But that's kind of how it's gonna look. And then you just want to make sure it's on the anvil really well. Put your stamp, try and keep it as vertical as possible, and then just do a few light taps. You might want to put this block underneath it actually. Probably have a little more background on there. But yeah, so what the stamp is basically doing, yeah, that didn't come out right. See, put a little too much force in there, hit it a little too many times. But what you just want to do is give it one, oh, that was the window. Give it one good smack, and it'll curl your material. This isn't coming out necessarily right how I want it to. I have used another anvil post. That's not really work. But I might have a different stamp that might work better. That just falls through. That does too. These are the full set of the dining stamps. But just give it one good hit. Make sure it curls around there. Make sure it doesn't mess up the top side too much. Just kind of going around, rotating it, trying to get all the sharp edges out. That looks pretty good. Except for this one. It's not great, but dang it. I'm actually going to drill all of these out and then do that top coat. I'm going to show me drilling it. But you basically just want to, if you mess up with that, you can go in the back with a little bit of a smaller drill bit and drill through, and then you can press these out. But yeah, I'll be back in a minute after I'm done with that. I'm going to see if I can this. But yeah, lots of music. Lots of lovely. What's it? So, done with this. Put maybe 3 or 4 coats on either side. probably 2 before I did the antiquing, and maybe 2 or 3 after I finished the antiquing. But I'm just gonna let this dry, and then I will punch those eyelets in, and I think we're done at that point. Yeah. And you can probably see on the sponge, it picked up a lot of that antiquing. I think that actually worked in my favor because the letters were pretty dark, but it lifted a lot of that black that was in the letters, and then it kind of kept it all settled in. Just doing a couple more little touch-ups around and in those letters, but I think that's pretty good. I'll be back in a little bit after this dries. But I didn't go as deep into those grooves as I would have liked. I think it still looks pretty good. I darkened up some areas in that leather, but this is still that Pro Resist. Maybe takes about 30 minutes to an hour. Depends on how many coats you do. And you can do more. If you do really thin coats, it dries a lot quicker. But since I did a lot of thin coats all at the same time, it's going to take a little longer to dry, but that's okay. I will be back in a little bit though. Now that the top coat is dry, I'm going to go back and just buff it really quick. Just like a medium to heavy pressure. Just make sure it's not picking up any residual stuff at the back too. And then hit the sides, just brush it. It's looking really good, really good. Now we're just going to put those eyelets in. Just putting them in first. I'm going to use a different anvil and punch this time. It's not exactly the right size for this, but I think it'll work a little better as a little alignment post to it. And the punch has a hole that fits over that post, and then it has a little curl to it. So I'm just going to go in, line it up, push it down as far as I can, make sure that anvil is still lined up. And go in, just kind of work it in. Yeah, that worked a lot better. Kind of puckered that just a little bit, but I think it came out pretty good. I think it's gonna look a lot better and hold still. If you feel like it might come out, you can put some glue in there. Just don't put a lot of glue in there or it'll spread. I would use a PVA or a slow acting super glue. That way it doesn't immediately dry, because then you'll have to go in with some acetone and it won't look as good because you'll have to acetone the glue off and then come back in and redo your processes. But this is pretty good. Gave it kind of a chamfer look, but I think it's still going to fit. This last one, just double checking back, but I'll probably show some beauty shots, but you know, pretty dang good. Again, it's not perfect, but it's the look I'm going for. You can kind of see the top coat because of the sheen on it, but they also have different top coats that are more matte looking, but they also have shinier ones, less shiny, and then just matte. It just depends on what you're going for. This is, I like how this is looking. This top coat it's not wet or tacky to the touch, but it probably won't be all the way dry for a couple of days even. But 24 hours is probably your best bet before you actually like take it out into the elements and stuff or get wet. But I'm just going back in and buffing it out, going around the buckle. I think we're pretty much done. Yeah, pretty much it. They also sell these eyelets in smaller and bigger sizes and different colors and stuff. This is the antique brass though. I went for that to match the buckle. But yeah, it feels pretty good. It feels solid. You can probably tell on the backside it's a little curled, but I don't think that's going to really do much, and that might actually help with comfortability. One spot that I feel. I'm just gonna go back over really quick. Just going back over it slightly to get any of the rough spots out. If you feel any rough spots, you don't really have to put another. I mean, you can if there's a lot, but if it's just minimal stuff, you can burnish over it. But yeah. So I'm just restitching these holes now because they didn't look as clean as I wanted to. Just pulled out a lot of thread, fold it in half. What I'm going to do is put one side in the eyelet with 2 pieces of thread and poke the head of the needle through one of the threads and poke it through the other. I'm going to go about an inch. It's kind of hard to show this, but just want to go about an inch behind the tail. Sorry for the bump. An inch behind the tail and poke it through the needle, pull it through, and then basically I'm just locking the thread on one side like that. And then what I'm going to do with the other side, you can either cut this in half, or what you can do is push it through, stab it through both at the same time, get about an inch behind the tail. Just pull that through, and then pull, if I can do it right. Yeah, actually do. So I just lock that on both sides. I'm gonna go in one hole to start off with. And probably want some pliers for this. Yeah, I'm gonna grab some pliers real quick. Have a little more leverage. Just using these small flat nose to pull it through if I can. Get it. So now that that's through, get about halfway. If you have a stitching pony or a small vise, if you have a small vise, you gotta be careful though. You just want to wrap the jaws of a small vise in a lot of shop towel or something, just that way you don't mar your leather. But so I'm just starting in one hole, and then I'm going to put this thread, this needle rather, go around and push it through that same hole. I'm gonna grab some different pliers for this. I'm gonna grab a little bit heavier duty pliers for this. That should be fine. But you just want to pull it through. Close this jaws up a little bit more. Maybe. I also want to be careful because you can break the needles, which I think I almost did. Yeah, so I'm actually going to restart this, just because this might be a little too thick for this application. But I'm just going to restart. Cut the needle off. Pull that out. So if I'm being a little quiet, try not to stab or cut myself. But so pull out a good length. That way you're not trying to fight your stitching. But what I'm going to do before I actually start stitching is make these holes just a little bit bigger with this ball. That could be a little difficult. Luckily nothing's spilling right now, so that's fine. But I'm just basically opening these holes with this awl. That way it makes it a little easier to push that thread and needle through. But you can also do this to make it a little easier on yourself by using a small drill bit, or a nail can even work, and basically just drill these holes a little bit bigger. It'll also help if you have a stitching pony, because then you don't have to worry about your piece moving on you. But I'm just gonna do what I'm used to. So just gonna poke this through again. I'm only doing a single layer of thread this time. That way I'm not fighting as much bulk when I'm pulling this through. I'm just gonna put the needle through, pull it, go about halfway. And you do want to use more thread than you think you need. That way, again, you're not fighting it. But so I'm just going to, it's kind of hard to show on camera, but hopefully I can get it. Just pulling through one side and leaving a little bit of a tail out. Grabbing my other needle, going through that same hole, pushing it through that loop. This is just a basic saddle stitch. There's a lot of different stitches out there that can work. But if you have more open holes in your leather, it's going to help you a lot with pulling that thread out. You might want to wear gloves or use pliers to pull on your thread. That way you're not digging into your fingers. I'm used to it from like doing paracord and stuff, so I kind of have blisters and stuff. But sometimes I wear leather gloves anyway if I'm doing a bigger project. That way I'm not making myself suffer more than I need. I'm just throwing the stitches in. I might do 2 passes just to get a little more strength, but this threading is pretty strong anyway because it's pretty uniform. They also make waxed threads that work pretty good. You want to be careful of that though. I just snapped my needle, so that's not great. I might, since these holes are so open, I might be able to get away with that. Yeah. Might not do 2 passes on this, actually. But what I'm doing is just the last couple of stitches. I'm going to go from the back and around and back through that same hole, if I can. This is the side with no needle, so it might be a little more difficult. There we go. Just getting it locked in on that side. I'm going to go back through that same side with that needle. This might actually be a little better for you to remember, because two different things going on now. But then I'm going to pass through. This is just back stitching. I'm going to pass through with that needle again, one hole over. That way I can tie it on the back and then lock it in. I'm going to these a little bit more. There we go. So now that that's good and stitched back up. You don't want to pull on your thread super tight because then you can cut into your leather, but you don't want it super loose because then it can get you off track or it can pull apart later on. I'm just throwing a couple of overhands on this. It's hard to show, but I'm basically just doing the same knot that you would do for tying shoes. Just throwing a couple of those over each other to lock it in. And then what I'm going to do with that broken needle, that way I'm not kind of wasting it. That'll give me a little more control. What I'm going to do, I'm just going to cut these. Leave a little bit of your tag. Leave a little bit of a tag on there. So that's It's pretty good. But what you want to do is heat up the tail and kind of press it in. They make these things. Mine died on me, but it's basically, it's just a thread melter. I don't think this one's gonna work anymore, but you can use it to cut your thread and then melt it and push it into itself. What I'm going to do with this needle though, just grab it with some pliers. You can do it with just open flame. Just be careful with it because you can scorch your leather. What I'm going to instead is just heat up this needle. My lighter doesn't die. Which of course it did. But, actually, just gonna use a match for this. Might be a little easier. Pretty good control with it, but just let it burn off for a second. Just hold it over, let it catch on fire, and then press it in. I might do one more little one. Just holding it over that little bump for a second, and pushing those threads into itself. Maybe that's pretty good. I think that's gonna hold. That's pretty much it. Just clean up your station. That way you don't have a mess or a headache later on. Well, you'll probably run for a while, but just like it. Just wrap your razor blades in tape. That way it doesn't cut anybody. But yeah, this is pretty much it. I'll probably do some beauty shots, like I said earlier.